Hello, one and all.
Hello, 6035.
I'm Michael,
I'm Nick.
and we're going to just do a little bit of talking about part 2 of the assignment. I think most of you have some idea where you're going or what you're looking at, but we really just wanted to clarify this a little bit more. So.
We also wanted to just very quickly just touch on what we saw at part 1 and some patterns that we think all of you can consider to improve your written work. So in terms of part 1, I personally felt that most people understood what the task was asking of them.
Yeah, I think the thing most people did is most people made... and I think when I fed back to people individually, they tried almost to do too much. So I think people probably made slightly too many points and found lots of stats and facts and evidence to back it up, but just didn't necessarily always explain the relevance of this.
Yeah.
So why, okay, these stats say that the number of viewers of the Premier League or the amount of money that's gone into the Olympics has increased over this many years, or now more people are able to watch sport than ever were before.
Yeah. And I think that demonstrates that people have a good understanding of the current affairs and maybe have read kind of online stuff or newspapers, or they kind of understand what the state of affairs are, but they haven't possibly analysed the meaning behind it.
I think it was the explanation and the meaning, like you said. So it was kind of saying, more people can watch football than ever before, or technology has meant that more people have been able to access the Olympics than ever before. And that was sort of left as the explanation of this was good. When people were saying this was a positive point, but actually it needed a bit more depth. Well, now more people are able to access this. Yeah. This means that sport is less elite than it used to be. More people are able to engage and enjoy and access this. Therefore, more people can understand it, use this in their leisure time. From the perspective of the sports, it's opened up a wider consumer market.
So once they've done their explanation, what they really need to then go on to discuss is the impact.
Yeah.
And I think that impact was a bit lacking, and that's your opportunity to discuss how you feel that that's changed the landscape, or the way that you feel that has...
Yeah, and it's that where it's gone from to. So a lot of people say, well, the stats now show this, but well, how has that changed for who and why? That was the big thing that I kind of felt was missing, was, well, what impact has this had? Has this,
So go from information-only explanation to more of, in my perspective, an argument. Argument for or an argument against. Rather than just information giving.
Yeah, I think that for me, that was one of the big things that I think most of them could do. And the other big thing that I think I spoke to most people about individually, but was really trying to link up and connect the different elements, right? How does this element
link to
another element?
And I do think that some people in their part 1, and I know it's just a draft, so I'm not too panicky about it, but I do feel like they've not stepped up to level 6 level of reading. And I think the level of reading would clarify some of those arguments for them.
Yeah, I think so. And again, what parts they're reading, I think I kind of got the feeling that a lot of people had skim-read stuff, so had maybe read sort of the first, the abstracts or the literature reviews. But actually, when you're going to be looking at the impact in a journal article or a book chapter, it's the stuff that's coming later on that sort of gives a bit more of the explanation of the impact. And I kind of felt that people sometimes hadn't really maybe drawn on that stuff as much as they possibly could have.
So a little bit superficial?
Yeah, I think so. And the other thing that I kind of got the feeling of as well is, in terms of readings, there was lots of references from the early to mid-2000s from a lot of people, which I think was because, some of the reading we'd given them from the early mid-2000s, and some of that's okay if you're talking about Maguire's definitions of globalisation, or if you're talking about some of Giulianotti's early works or whatever, that stuff's okay, but they'd be using that to make claims about current trends.
Yeah.
And that's, if they were talking about the 2016 Olympics as an example, a reference from 1999 or 2005 wasn't necessarily...
Because stuff has moved on.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And that's where maybe they would need to then demonstrate their ability to consider the alternative, that strength and weakness. This is how it was, and this is how it is.
And I think that discussion of where things impact, where things have moved from to, is really important, whether it's on an individual personal level or on a much wider level. I think that's stuff that in part 2 I'd really like people to sort of do a little bit more of.
So should we go on to part 2?
Yeah. Let's move on to part 2. So the first thing, I spoke to a couple of people, and people are getting very caught up on the global flows in this heading. So the heading part 2, paying particular attention to a maximum 2 global flows, use sociological theory to critically analyse one issue related to global sport. And I've used the term issue here, but I've also, I think in the marking criteria, also used the term phenomena. So one issue or phenomena, one thing that is happening in particular. So
that's significant.
That's significant. So this, for me, for those people who did level 5 social issues, this part of the essay is much more similar to that assignment last year.
Yeah.
So this is where people would take one particular issue or one particular phenomena. So it could be nationalism and national identity, for example, which you covered with Stuart. It could be race, which I've covered on the online stuff. It could be some of the sexuality stuff that Nicola's covered. It could be some of the gender stuff that Nicola's covered. It could be things like football migration and players. I know someone I was speaking to actually wanted to discuss esports and gaming, which isn't something we've covered.
But it's really interesting.
And
on an international scale.
Yeah, and it's something that you could make sense of. But this section is about being much deeper.
Yeah.
Whereas before you sort of, okay, this is the superficial impact of sport. It could be, again in this section, things like refugees.
Another thing that would be quite interesting in terms of social class, if you look at London 2012, a lot of the kind of legacy ideas.
Yeah.
And that criticality, has it really made an impact? Has it,
Yeah.
What was his ideals? What is the reality?
So this is where you would take, for us, you might take things like media and ideology, for example, and you discuss those. So when I've done the videos on race, I've really gone into media representation and ideology. And within that, I spoke about the idea of moral panic, the idea of representation of migrants, the idea of this notion of black criminality, which is sometimes tied into particular athletes, the representation of physicality, etc. Yeah. And all of those are ideological beliefs that are underpin and represent race within society and how they're represented. And I particularly focused on how the media represented those. Yeah. Nicola spoke a lot about gender ideologies.
Yeah. And some of that has become really significant in ideas of people starting to compete. That in Australia we've seen people competing individually and in AFL, and the idea of where does the transgender body belong within the sporting, because we have such a gender binary within sport as a social structure.
So for me, like in this part of the assignment, this is where I think you need to go, okay, I'm picking one of these areas. So if it's player migration, I need to maybe pick 3 or 4 main points that I want to make, and I'm going to argue and counter-argue. Or in depth. And, I've said, if you pick these 3, so 3 main themes, if you like, and then within them you might have a point regarding positive, a point regarding negative. So, like, in this idea of moral panic, you might take 1 paragraph, about 300 words, discussing the negative representation of black male athletes and the moral panic regarding that, and you might use examples regarding Raheem Sterling and Colin Kaepernick, in that they are seen to, from a negative perspective, they are seen to challenge traditional historical ideas about Britishness, Americanness. Kaepernick's attack on the flag, as some parts of the see it. Where the other side of things, you might then argue, well, actually, do you know what? Since the change in the media, since the social media and development of that, there is a strong critical support of these athletes. Some of these racialised ideas that have been traditionally held by the mainstream media are challenged by social media. So Kaepernick's actions are fueled by Black Lives Matters. Black Lives Matters is effectively something that happened as an online form of civil rights. And that would be maybe one paragraph on the negative, another paragraph on the resistance.
And when Michael talks about negative and positive, it's all that hedging language. It's all that arguably strongly suggests one could consider that.
Yeah.
And we want you to move away from that causality of this is because.
Yes.
Towards language that is.
Because it's nuanced, right?
Yeah.
And when I say that, I mean it's complex. So the theme that I spoke about there in relation to moral panic is that some individuals may argue that a number of black athletes are often represented in the media in a way which is seen to contradict traditional historical values.
Yeah.
So I've used there the term is argued that their representation is, it goes against the historical values of that country, which therefore creates a sense of moral panic, or this sense that these individuals that these black athletes don't conform to the same idealised notions of cultural identity that other people in that country historically have done.
So Hudson's made that point, and what he would require then is some academic literature that would support his point.
Yeah.
And if he was being really clever about it, then he'd have multiple literature that would synthesise that argument and would come from different perspectives, possibly.
Yeah, so that first point, I might support that with Kevin Hilton, Ben Carrington, a number of athletes and scholars in that area. I then might go on to explain this, and this is where the theory would come in, that I might then use Stuart Hall's notion of folk devils, so can be used in this example to understand how black youth from this subculture are demonised in a way which represents contradictions to the historical culture. So,
and then you might use an example.
So therefore, I might then put in there examples of athletes such as Raheem Sterling and Colin Kaepernick
to exemplify your argument.
Yeah, so I might then use them and see how Raheem Sterling is always seen to go against conservative British culture.
Yeah.
Examples of his representation in the media. So his idea about moral panic, he's linking to stabbings, which is just obscene, and I go through it in the video. And then I could use Kaepernick, as another example of how he goes against. He's seen as anti-American because he kneeled during the flag, and this is a moral panic. This is a moral dilemma. We should all stand up. And
And then you come up with this counter argument.
Oh, well, first of all, I'd explain that. So I provide the evidence and I can explain. Therefore, this portrayal of them as something that's contradictory to the historical culture, that contradicts the traditional way of Britishness or Americanness, therefore portrays black athletes as other. It then portrays them as being different. It then portrays a contradictory symbol of blackness and black behaviours and otherness, and therefore links them to social problems that are much wider spread and rooted in. So that would be my explanation. Then, as you said, once I've followed that, I might then counter-argue in the following paragraph that actually, while that mainstream media is doing that, we've got this position of resistance
through social media, and,
Through-
and the evidence would be, I don't know, 1.7 million people following Colin Kaepernick, how many people have watched his YouTube videos around Black Lives Matter, about his online activism. You know, so there's a little bit of evidence to counter that.
So I'd then be providing this counter argument. I mean, when you look at the Raheem Sterling stuff, the backlash on social media regarding the media's representation, and this is what Stuart Hall would say, that actually culture is not something that is always sort of monolithically, terrible long word, that isn't produced solely. We don't interpret it in one way.
Yeah.
And actually, it's something that's fought over. It's something there's conflict over.
Yeah.
And actually, in modern society, technology has allowed us to resist those historical racisms, if you like.
And you know, there's this concept of kind of citizen journalism.
Yes.
Where actually now, instead of media holding the power, there's that kind of there's this kind of I can't get my words out.
Hegemony.
Yeah,
so the hegemony is...
The dominant hegemony was
with the media.
Multinational corporates owning the media, whereas now you see this idea of citizen journalism where people have a voice, and where they're able to express themselves.
And so therefore, culture becomes a contested field again. So that would be how I might form those two counter-arguments. Now, I've focused a lot on those two areas because...
That's what you're interested in.
That's what I'm interested in.
And that's what you need to do. You need to be interested in something that can significantly be held as a point. So not just something minor. This needs to be something that you can put meat on the bones, that you can develop further.
Yeah, and those counter-arguments have to be related. So if you take those, for me, those are in one theme. Right, so that theme there is moral panic and racialised representation.
Yeah.
That's one theme, right? So I've got maybe 600 words on this idea of moral panic and racialised representation.
Yeah.
Now, if you're looking at, say, it's player migration, and you're looking at player migration and the economic benefits of player migration, I was speaking to a student about this yesterday. That may be one thing, 600 words roughly.
Yeah.
300 word paragraph, 300 word paragraph.
Oh, paragraphs would be nice too.
Possibly against.
Nice, clear paragraphs.
Yeah.
That would be great.
And this is where I'm sort of saying I think people should really plan it and try to do sort of 600 words or so per theme, per section. And in that example, my point might be for my first one that player migrations allowed individuals to come from poverty to get more income than they had before. My evidence might be the number of players from developing nations who have been able to access a great amount of income than they would previously have been able to do that. Okay, and that is through migration, that is through capitalist society, that is through the greater amount of income and money that exists in that society. All right, I might then explain that in relation to some of these ideas regarding migration and actually cosmopolitanism, that football has become a cosmopolitan game. Football is now, there's not necessarily national identity is weakened, but cosmopolitan identity is strengthened. And that cosmopolitan identity has allowed people to make more money. That cosmopolitan change to the games allow people to make more money. This is really, really positive. So I might do that paragraph discussing these positives of player migration. Now, from an economic perspective. Now, the second following paragraph to that, I might look at something like who makes the most money from this? And I might make the link to this idea of cultural imperialism, because there is still a trade of non-Western players to the West. There's still a reliance on, if I'm an English player, I don't have to migrate or move countries. I don't have to become an economic migrant. I can choose to. I can choose to go to Spain or France or wherever else.
Bale.
Sorry? Gareth Bale. I can make that choice to, but I don't have to. Whereas if I'm an African or a South American or an Asian player, I have to make that decision to become an economic migrant. Therefore, there is still a imbalance in society.
But also then an imbalance in power because, for example, African leagues maybe significantly weakened. So they could have gained media finance, they could have gained sponsorship support, but because they're now deemed weaker or of less value, they haven't got as much monetary power as the West.
So that's how I would make those arguments and ensuing counter-argument. Now, the point that I'm making there is that those are both connected. They're both very clearly connected. How might I support that second theory? I might use something like Marxism to support that second argument, right? So that there is a dominant bourgeoisie elite of, that bourgeoisie exists in relation to clubs and agents, okay? Those clubs and agents are then exploiting the labour of X amount of people, and they are moving them from one country to another. They are then weakening and undermining any systems of others, and they are reproducing wealth and elite for themselves. So from that scenario, I may use Marxism to support that. I might then counter some of those arguments with neoliberalism and discuss individuals.
And individuals having power. So in some ways, football athletes have more power than maybe any other sport because they're the best paid athletes on the whole. So they do have a lot more agency than they previously had.
Exactly.
Possibly. You could argue.
And so I could go on and discuss all of these things, like, you might then, your second theme might be like nationalism and national identity, and you might discuss player migration in relation to that. But again, you do the same thing. Some discussion of the positive, some discussion of the negatives to go through that.
Yeah.
So that would be the way that we would see this happening.
And the social theory just needs to really underpin that discussion. So we can't just have lots of examples and explanations of this athlete moved to this club and this cost this much and this and this is. So it's not about just the stats, it's about the meaning behind it, and you draw the meaning from the social theory that you use to explain it.
Yeah, so the social theory for me links the personal to the structural. So it links the example to the wider social structures. So that example I've just given regarding player migration, you might be making the example of Jorge Mendes and how he could be seen to be exploiting South American talent. But what the point you'd be making is Jorge Mendes goes and buys a load of players, lots and lots of players. He then trades those players for increased value for himself. Okay, and by trading those players, he's got maybe 100, 200 or so players on his books. But actually, only a small number of them manage to make anywhere near the same amount of wealth he does. They become the petty bourgeoisie. They become those individuals who can gain some income, who can gain some economic benefit. And he's moved them from being a situation of being dependent on him and poverty to being well off. Now, from that example, what you're doing is you're saying, well, here, there's 200 odd people who are maybe engaged in the physical labour of being a footballer. Okay, it's not factory work, but it's physical labour in the same way that historically Marxism may have seen factory work to exist. Okay, and in this process then, that dependence on him or another agent to facilitate that trade and that movement of labour then means that they are dependent on him and dependent on the large clubs and corporations for their income. Therefore, even though some of them are very well paid and become part of that petty bourgeoisie,
and the well paid part might be pacifying them.
Yeah.
So therefore they may not feel the urge to have more power because
there's also
money is
within this notion, the first part there we're talking about social mobility, right? So your first paragraph might be people are, due to globalization, people can be more socially mobile than they ever were before. So if I'm an African or a South American or an Asian footballer, my previous paragraph, I might be making a really positive point saying that people are able to become much more socially mobile in a neoliberal society, in this global society where we've broken down national barriers, we've we've made truly cosmopolitan and international leagues.
Yeah.
Players are able to move their labour, apply labour in different parts. They are able to get out of poverty and therefore become more socially mobile. And that social mobility is allowing them to come from a poor background, possibly.
Yeah.
There is an assumption here that I'm making that all South Americans or Asians or Africans are poor.
Which is a westernised perspective.
Which is a westernised perspective, which actually in itself has some sort of racialised undertones that I'm making. But social mobility has increased through globalisation. However, when we look at social mobility
more
deeply, why is social mobility a problematic idea? Because even though we've broadened who can access, so we've increased the number of people who can become socially mobile and access this elite structure, actually the structure's not changed.
Still the same people in power.
Still the same people in power. Still, actually, yes, more people can make, more people from a wider variety of places can make more money. But there's still only 11 people who can play in a team. There's still only 20 teams in a league. There's still only a certain amount of people who can make it to that level. So this idea of social mobility is, when we look at academy players in England, we're saying 1% of academy players in England make it. Then if we compare that to non-Western nations, what does that look like, right? So these are the sort of questions that we would use to critique some of those points that we're making.
So if Michael's gone into real depth in that it's a very critical look at that argument that you're trying to put across. So whatever argument you're trying to put across, you need to apply the same level of criticality to it. So you can't just take things on face value, and you need to be demonstrating that you have an understanding of actually different perspectives on that subject.
And that first perspective I was given was related to, I think Stuart covered this in his lecture, the neoliberal political ideology, which is very closely associated with capitalism and the capitalist ideology. Now, again, even now, I've tried to go point, evidence, explain, link, but sometimes I've gone off on a tangent, right? So if I was going to make that point there, my point would be increased social mobility and increased access for people across the globe. My evidence would be X amount of players from non-Western nations can now access and play in the league.
Yeah.
I've got some statistics to back it up.
And then you need academic
And then I'm going to
support.
explain it. I've got academic support from literature that's telling me, Giulianotti's work or somebody else's work saying this many people have migrated and this is the reason why and so forth. And then I'm explaining that using the notion of neoliberalism, the idea of individuality, because neoliberalism puts the emphasis on the individual. So individuals are now able to access more. They're more able to be socially mobile. They are more able to do this. And that would be part of my explanation as well. Okay? And that would be how I would go through that. Now, in terms of my writing, what I would encourage people to do is sometimes you've got these ideas and you've got these points in your head. Are you planning it out clearly in that way that I've just sort of explained it before you start writing? Because most of you have the ideas. The sociological theory maybe not as strongly as I do, but you have the ideas and the understanding in the same extent that I do, I think.
But sometimes your counter-argument is a different point rather than a counter-argument against the same point. So really be careful that you're making this argument, but your counter-argument is really closely linked. It's not just a different point.
So my counter-argument, if my first one's about social mobility, my counter-argument is... Should be, or maybe around... not manipulation, sorry, it's around exploitation.
Yeah.
And
so actually lack of social mobility.
Lack of social...
Or just a veneer of social mobility.
So this one's about the ideology of social mobility. It's been promoted to people. Anyone can become wealthy through football. We can all make it. It's a meritocracy.
Yeah.
Great. People from across the world can make it. But the paragraph afterwards says, who really benefits? One or two individuals benefit, but actually the clubs...
The reality is this.
And the reality might be the clubs and the agents. And that would be the way that I would frame those arguments to say that they related to each other.
Yeah.
Now, you at the end of that may feel more strongly about the first point, or you may feel more strongly about the second point.
And make that clear.
And you make that clear. That's where you argue that. If you think, Hobson, you're a horrible commie who's really saying these players are exploited when they're on 200k a week, you're being an idiot, then obviously don't say it in those terms, but state, actually, while I see this argument of social mobility is surely a stronger argument because it encourages this, and this.
And those becauses are really important.
Yeah.
So make sure that you've got that kind of explanation. So really think about your one issue.
Really think about your one issue. Think about what your 3 themes within that issue are.
Yeah.
Then think about, within those themes, what are the 2 points that you are likely to make? Okay, how do they relate to particular flows, ideology and media, or money and migration, or
national identity?
National identity, I would say, sort of like an ideology-driven one. But
if you've got a thing within that,
But anyway, I guess what we'd say is, right, first of all, to summarise, you think about what it is you want to talk about. You think about what your 3 themes are. Then within that, you think about what your points are. How do they relate to your flows? And then
what underpins it?
What theories relate or underpin it? And how do you break that down in terms of evidence and explanation?
And then, so really look at this idea of the thing for me is that you're really talking through about, first part is about the impact and about explaining what's the significance. I think the significance for me is a really big deal. I didn't get that enough in part 1. And then part 2 is that you've considered one thing that you're really interested in. And then you've made sense of that one thing.
And I think part 1 is generic. Part 2 is almost like a case study of one thing. And again, it's worth noting that globalisation is never wholly positive or wholly negative. It's a trading off. So media impact is a trading off. Gender ideologies are a trading off.
And I know some of you are really quite passionate, and what you tend to do is have lots and lots and lots of points, and I just don't think that is needed. So try not to be a scattergun approach to it. Try to and I think that is down to your planning. So in your planning, you make a really significant point that you can put a lot of meat on it, and you can discuss heavily, rather than go this and this and this and this.
And this is I guess what I was going back to. In my mind, before you write, you plan, right? And before you plan, you decide 3 themes. So it could be, like I just said, if I was doing race, I might do moral panic, representation of good and bad migrants, and black criminality. Right? They might be my 3 themes. And within those, I might have 2 points for each of those themes. Okay? And what are those points? How am I going to provide evidence? How am I going to explain them? What am I going to use to explain them? Now, for me, I would use British cultural studies to explain those points, with maybe a little bit of critical race theory in there, for that perspective. But if you're doing gender, again, and this sounds very formulaic, but it's to make sure you don't go off on a tangent. I would do something like that. Now, if you've got a way that works for you, and you've been hitting 60s and 70s plus, and you've been felt really confident, and what I'm saying is freaking you out, don't go, oh my God, I've got to follow exactly what Michael said. I've got to only have 6 of this, and I've got to do that. But if you've been maybe getting feedback going, your work's a bit scattergun, you've been getting work in the thirds or low to mid 2s, and you go and you don't really provide depth, or you don't really explain, or your paragraphs are a bit long, or your paragraphs are a bit short, then I would really think to try and do something like that. And, give yourself something you can work towards. And then the other thing people ask me, so how many references should I have for a paragraph? Is often the thing that I would get. And I also, it's not quite that straightforward or easy. However, if I was to look at this here, what are the main points of the argument you're going to make? There should always be references to back up the point you're making, right? What is the evidence you're going to provide? So you might provide evidence that you back up from a study, or you might provide evidence that you back up with examples.
Yeah.
But one of them's academic, one of them's contemporary, right?
So I might look at, say, sexuality, and I might put across the fact that there's this real dominant sexuality and dominant hegemony of heterosexuality, which was evident with Bastareaud being selected as captain for the Six Nations, despite calling somebody a faggot a couple of weeks previously and getting a few weeks ban.
So that would be the contemporary example.
And that would be the contemporary example. And then I'd say maybe, however, Anderson studies of rugby players found that there was a more inclusive masculinities where men were demonstrating homosocial behaviours, etc. And then I might support Anderson's argument, which can be seen during the Autumn Internationals, where Gareth Thomas was beaten on the streets, and the French Federation were the first to come out to immediately support and wear the rainbow flag, rainbow laces.
And then I'd have to explain that using a theoretical lens. And
then I'd use a theoretical lens of demonstrating maybe, possibly, where the power shift is changing even over a very short period of time.
So again,
from over 6 month period, we've seen the French dominant heteronormative behaviour actually transition towards...
And that would be, again, a reference using Anderson's inclusive masculinity theory. So you started off by making a point that you're supported by evidence, by literature. You've provided evidence from a contemporary example.
And then I talk about that power shift.
Talked about that power shift, providing evidence from academic literature. There's maybe another example in there. And then you sort of link that power shift to Anderson's inclusive masculinity theories.
And maybe how it's problematic, and we can see how it's problematic.
Yeah, and I think you do, within one paragraph, you've probably got 300 words or so to do that. The point is, each one of these questions I'm asking here, I think it's a bit of, they need to be supported.
Absolutely.
And the only time that you really bring in non-academic sources is this question here: what evidence can we provide? How do contemporary examples?
Yeah.
So I would only look for one or two examples from contemporary society in that paragraph.
Whereas everything else
should be related to academic literature in the form of studies, or academic literature in the form of theories in books.
Yeah.
So I think,
Is that helpful? I hope so.
I hope so. I hope we don't ramble too much. I think if we, please, by all means, don't get too caught up on doing exactly as we say.
Yeah.
But do listen and, do pause, rewind, and come to the bits where we said something that's helpful. If I'm rambling on about football and you don't care about football,
speed it up.
Speed it up. I probably should have said this. At the start, not the end. But okay.
But so then we go into conclusion. 500 words. Summary of your main points, dead easy. Okay, not repeating yourself, but kind of what conclusions have you drawn from what you've read?
And within that,
where do you feel the state of affairs right now, at this present moment?
And I'll put 500 words. It may not always be quite 500 words.
Yeah.
Ultimately, you are suggesting no new examples in this point.
Yeah.
Shouldn't really be any new literature at this point either, unless to say that actually, while this is considered this idea, maybe I should go and look at this further. Or maybe other examples need to be considered.
Yeah.
This is where you get to sort of say, while I feel globalisation has been positive, or while I feel it's been negative, or while actually gender ideologies have been challenged, or media flows have been important, actually I feel more greatly towards positive, or I feel myself relate more.
All of this. The evidence that I have read has...
Yeah, the evidence. Sorry, that's a better way of putting it.
Has encouraged me,
the evidence,
but not me, because you're not going to use I or...
The evidence and the research suggests that largely, actually, it can be seen to be
this.
negative here, but positive here.
Yeah.
But further research should consider this here.
This.
But I didn't have enough room to look at that in this study.
Yeah. So we hope that's helpful. We hope that you've got something out of that and that clarifies what we're expecting from you.
Yeah, I've got really nothing to add to that.
So best of luck.
Best of luck, and see how many people actually view this.